The GovX show is supported by Forrester, helping government organisations perform at their best. Visit forrester.com to learn more.
Hi and welcome to another episode of the GovX show. I am Tim Coulthard, Community Director here at GovX Digital. And in today's episode, we're going to be exploring the growing trend that sees private sector leaders making the switch into the public sector. We want to understand what skills and mindset they bring, what motivates them to make that switch, and then how the public sector organisations can make the most of their skills. So to help us do that, we have a couple of guests. We have Suzie Walker, who's an experienced headhunter who's placed private sector leaders into the public sector, so seen firsthand how it works, what the challenges and opportunities might be. And we also have our GM for government, David Wilde, who has worked in numerous public sector leadership roles, so understands firsthand what sort of environment they'll encounter when they get there. So let's hand over to them now. So David and Suzie, welcome to the GovX show. It's great to have you here and really looking forward to a conversation around, I guess, the future of public and private sector digital leadership and some of the interesting patterns we're seeing emerge, a sort of movement between the two spaces, and really start to unpack why that is and what the nature of sort of leadership roles is in 2021. So welcome to you both. Before we sort of crack on, I'd really be interested to find out a bit more about your areas of expertise and interest around this topic. Suzie, David's appeared regularly on the show, so it'd be great to start with you and find out a bit more about you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So a little bit of a very, very brief background to put a context in terms of what I do. So I run a headhunting firm. Our expertise is in recruiting high-performing senior talent across data, digital, and tech and transformation, basically, for the private sector. So we would work for FTSE 100, FTSE 250 or private equity-backed companies. They vary in terms of size, from scale-ups to corporates, and from more traditional firms to, fintech, health tech, consumer tech. And I think that the interesting thing that I've seen before I hand over to David is that we've seen a bit of a sea change in the last probably 12 months in terms of candidates from the private sector being more socially minded, motivated to move into the public sector. And in light of the, ambitious and rather exciting plans that the government have for the digital transformation, I think that could be really useful, interesting to have some great talent moving across. So hopefully that, and I think the other thing I just wanted to mention is that the time of the conversation also is pretty relevant with Alex Chisholm. He's made some key appointments or announcements of appointments recently. So you've got Paul Wilmot, who's coming in as the chair of the CDDO. So he's coming from Lego. And, his background really accurately reflects the kind of candidates that we would work with. Joanna Dameson, she's been promoted into the executive director role. She was IBM until the last few years when she moved across to public sector. And Tom Reed is chief exec of GDS. So I know he's been in the cabinet office for a number of years, but he was with Barclays before. So really, really talented individuals. And that really is a pretty accurate reflection of the kind of people that we would work with. So that's prompted the conversation. And David, I'll pass over to you.
Lovely, great, thanks very much. And just playing through on that, Tim, so my interest particularly in this area is I've spent the best part of 20 years not only being a CIO and a board member of a number of public sector organisations, but I've been heavily involved in recruiting CIOs either as part of the boards or providing technical advisor kind of roles for organisations, and I still do that now. And what I've seen is a shift away from promoting from within and focusing on technology, and actually much more in the way of strategic thinking and governance and broader leadership. So basically bringing transformation to life in a way that organizations as a whole can understand. As Suzie's mentioned there is an interesting inflection from private sector into public sector that's happening right now. We've been here before, with private and public sector roles, and I've seen them come in, I've seen them go out. I think the difference now is there's been a general maturing in the public sector environment that means that there's more chance of people going the distance and working with it. But I also strongly believe that there's been a sea change in the private sector, where there is a recognition of contribution to social good is really cantering up the charts in terms of people's interests and passion. And so, you know, it is a good time to kind of play into that environment and see what we can do to capitalize on it. And guess who benefits out of all of this? Taxpayers, us. Excellent. Bring it on.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So I'd like to start by understanding, you know, who we're dealing with here, who are we talking about, and what motivates them, maybe in more recent history and now. And I think you've both alluded to the fact that maybe some of the previously held conventions around what motivates sort of senior leaders in public versus private sector, you know, could be sort of pigeonholed quite neatly, and maybe those sort of, there's a blurring of those sort of behaviours and values. But you know, traditionally we might say, well, what motivates somebody working in the private sector in terms of a sort of digital leadership role? Is it the kind of typical commercial drivers of revenue and profit? And then in the public sector, are we looking at something more about purpose and social benefit? Do we feel that those still hold true, or are we actually seeing quite a significant shift? I mean, as we've said, social purpose and social value are much more prevalent across all aspects of life, you know, whether that's sort of brand purpose and the way that, you know, consumer brands are pushing their sort of social activities more sort of for. And then there's a lot of sort of research around how younger people coming into this workplace are much more motivated by the sort of mission of the organization that they work for and so on. But those senior players that are already there, are they changing as well? What do we feel? Suzie, why don't you have a crack at that? It's a big one, but I think it's obviously essential to understanding what we're talking about here.
Yeah, you're right. It's a really interesting one, and it's a core question. I think those core motivators in the private sector, I don't think they're as clear cut anymore. Previously, if you looked at it, yes, I think you'd be right. It would be about revenue, profit generation, you know, shareholders, and social responsibility would have been a lot lower down the list. But this change that's happening, and if you look at the boards, the main boards of private sector companies, the key people or the key roles that will be driving growth in those businesses are around customer, data, and digital and tech. And so if you look at the strategy for the private sector companies, they will want a customer-centric strategy. The dynamic that shifted is the customer for the private sector is putting those companies under pressure, if you like, to be more socially responsible. So in order to have an effective customer-centric strategy, it's got to have social responsibility built into it. So yes, of course, at the end of the day, they will have shareholders where they have to deliver value back to. That's life in the private sector. They're commercial businesses. But at the core of those customer-centric strategies will be the social responsibility element. And that, if you haven't got that, if a business has sort of missed that memo, it's really, really hard to build customer engagement, and it's really hard to build brand loyalty. And therefore, how do you keep generating growth? So yeah, I think it's definitely not as clear cut as it used to be.
And David, you've obviously been there sort of on the public sector side. I'd be interested to know what lies beneath the sort of the headline of, you know, social responsibility or sort of social benefit. Obviously, there'd be multiple aspects to that. From your experience, what are the sort of drivers of sort of senior leaders in the public sector?
Well, I mean, certainly I think the CSR piece, the corporate social responsibility piece, is definitely forming a bridge between private and public sector. Where I think it's fair to say there was quite a chasm for quite a long time, and that is helping. And that's helping with this kind of shift that we're seeing in behaviour. Public sector has historically, people go into public sector for more vocational purposes than they do for. You certainly don't go into it for profit, believe me. And for you know, revenue generation, that's kind of not where they're at. However, so the big drivers in public sector historically have been around variety, around public good. And around making a difference, you know, that's very much, whether it be at national level or local level. But what's interesting on the technology landscape, and particularly focusing on this around those kind of digital CIO kind of roles, this kind of stuff, is there's also been, I think, a nice bit of leveling around what the technology is in those different sectors, where the commoditization and consumerization of a lot of the technology that's out there now has meant that what looked like tech in local government looks not that different to what looks like tech in a bank now, in many respects. So the perceived, and I strongly believe actually it is more perceived than real, the perceived gap in what that stuff does isn't there anymore. And so people's confidence in transitioning across those sectors from a professional and technical perspective in terms of understanding, and that's right up to and including strategic, so board level stuff, I think has been helpful in moving that. Combined with that shift in CSR means the private people that were in the private sector are reaching towards public sector more than they were, because they can feel better about what they're doing. Frankly, that's a good thing. And the third point is actually pay parity isn't that wide relative on large organizations. You think about a CIO in a large unitary council is looking after a 20 million pound budget, will have a couple hundred staff, and will be making a difference to 300,000 people and supporting an organization of several thousand on £1 billion a year turnover. That's FTSE 250 all day long. Right. And they are rewarded at typically the 120 to 130,000 range, which is not that dissimilar to what you find in the private sector. Now, they're not paid more. I think there is that's like, it is a bit less, but it's not as big a margin as people think in terms of, if you like, your earning power. So that brings again even closer together that bridge. It brings that bridge across those two sectors. So that's an interesting one to kind of play through on there.
Absolutely. And I'm interested in understanding, let's say, before we get onto the sort of the transition piece of sort of senior moving across from private to public, if we look at the sort of typical career path for a senior, digital technology CIO type role in both the public and the private sectors, what kind of career paths would we expect them to have if they sort of stay in their lane, stay with the private sector all the way through versus public sector? David, I know your CV relatively well now, and I know you've held lots of interesting, diverse roles. Is it the case that in the private sector you're more likely to have a sort of more of a one flavour career, whereas the public sector is different? And is that one of the things that's sort of dragging people across, the more variety, more challenge?
I'd say no. I mean, my career path is very unusual. Relative. There's not many CIOs that spent a number of years in policy work, and at the age of 22 years old was running a benefit office in Battersea. That's kind of where I came from. So I've come through a very winding path, it's fair to say, in terms of where I've got to. A lot of the CIOs in the government world, both central and local government, historically have tended to come up through the technology pathway. And or they've come in through the private sector in their junior roles and have come into the public sector at mid-management level and then work their way up. That's quite common. Okay. In the private sector, historically that would have been the case, but in the private sector there has been much more in the way of people coming from, as Suzie said, coming in from customer, because technology's driven customer change, and they have taken on technology, rather than being from within technology and growing up. So I think there is that difference. That said, public sector and local government have probably mirrored that. I'd say, well, not probably, have in fact mirrored that to some extent, where, my first CIO role in Waltham Forest, I was CIO and head of customer services. I had both. In my first 12 months, it was sorting out the technology, but then they asked me to take on, as the director, the customer services function as well, when they realized how integral customer and technology were to each other on service transformation. So that's how play through. The other angle where I've seen people coming up into that world has been through service transformation and turnaround, which is how I ended up actually originally in the technology world, where a lot of my work in government was dealing with organisations that were broken and fixing them. So going into Whitehall departments where there were troubles, and in the late 90s, when I was doing a lot of this, most of the stuff that went wrong was IT. So so by accident almost, I ended up dealing more with IT than anything else, and then built a reputation for turnaround on technology organisations, and so that has meant that in the private sector I've seen a similar drive through where program management and transformation has also swept up technology. So customer transformation and tech have converged in both sectors in not too dissimilar ways. And I think that brought the fresh blood in that has and the leadership that's basically taken out the old boundaries of, if you don't know what a WAN, a LAN, and structured systems analysis and design methodology is, you're not going to be a CIO. Those days are long gone. The thing that I'm interested in, I'd love to hear Suzie's view on this though, is what I am seeing in all sectors is a resurgence of some very particular specialist roles in technology, enterprise architecture, data analysts and data CEOs, chief data officers, and also the kind of client functions, managing, because so much of our technology now, you don't run it in-house, you buy it. And so I'm seeing a growth of very, very tech savvy commercial people working within the technology function. And they're not unique to local government. I think that they're coming, or public sector more generally. I think that's coming across all sectors. And those folks have huge potential to move around.
So the analyst roles, the data analysts, and data roles in general are probably the fastest growing area of recruitment. Full stop at the moment. The demand for data talent, but to your point, specialised roles. So under if you've got on your main exec, if you've got your chief customer data tech or transformation officer, depending on the nature of the business and how they've split that up, you will then have some pretty senior but very specialized roles that sit within that. But chief data officers, the demand for that is unbelievable, and the salaries are high. And the recruitment of data analysts right now, I think I'm probably pretty accurate in saying it's one of the fastest growing areas of recruitment right now.
Yeah, and where I think there'll be a challenge for public sector, and I found this and I still find this, is actually public sector are struggling to get those people. They don't have the salaries as such that they're not into that zone, but also public sector don't have the depth that those kind of so pharma companies create vast analytic functions and pay people huge amounts of money to run them because it is their lifeblood. That's how their business lives and and moves on. In public sector, both in central and in local government, it's much more about a lighter touch on what we do with data and analytics. I think that's going to become deeper, but it's never going to be at the extent that those wholly analytics driven commercial entities are. So there's an interesting conversation there where the government is trying to recruit these people on 110,000 a year when the farmers are paying 250. It's just
the appeal. The appeal's obviously coming from somewhere else, as you've alluded to already, David, around
exactly. But health, I think, is where that's going to converge and where there's going to be some challenge. And what's going to be interesting there is where the middle ground might play through, where in the health environment, partnerships with your AstraZenecas and all that, and those kind of go will probably be the way that will work through.
Yes.
Those functions won't actually be NHS full-time functions. There'll be partnership arrangements where you can overcome those salary demands and get the depth and create those kind of specialist entities that will be needed, and the NHS will benefit from that without necessarily having to employ them directly. But that's in the nature of that ecosystem, and I think that's probably right. Actually, would make sense. Whitehall's problem, I think, is deeper and harder. We have the artificial cap. You'll be well aware, you know, that no one gets paid more than the Prime Minister without getting it signed off by, you know, half the permanent secretaries in government. It's kind of, you know, this kind of artificial construct at the 151 mark, you know, is 152 mark, whatever it is, I think is something that will continue to apply quite heavy pressure on Whitehall departments to be able to step up. You know, and I'm thinking in terms of, you know, the likes of HMRC. You know, HMRC is data rich, has to be much data richer. Yeah. And the core of HMRC's future direction of travel is massive use of analytics and artificial intelligence as it becomes stronger. Yeah. They're not going to be able to recruit people 150,000.
No, they're not. You're right. It's going to be about collaboration, isn't it? Collaboration with the private sector will be the way, you know, will be the way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so there's those kind of things that will kind of play through. I mean, and CTOs stroke enterprise architects are a really interesting professional kind of vertical, which are undervalued, I think, in the public sector, massively valued in the private sector. You know, if you don't know your architecture, you're probably going to go bust. Right? So they invest in these things, and in the public sector, they're still treated as techies, pure techies, rather than people that understand how the architecture of the technology will work to help the business grow, or in the case of public sector, can help make that difference. Where that's going to change in the next year or two is going to be around the place arena and around the massive influx of things like IoT and smart places and all that kind of stuff. And I think there's going to be an interesting challenge there on how we're going to shape and develop and create those opportunities and entice those people to come into that marketplace. And I think it's local government that's going to have to do it, because that's what they exist for. That's where they came from. And it's going to drive, I think, a need for some partnership working with your Jacobs of the world and those kind of big kind of outfits that work in strategic spatial thinking. But I think there's a great opportunity there for the public sector to really bring in that depth of knowledge on how to do that stuff in a way to help with that shaping of those places fit for the future.
Yeah. I'm interested to expanding on that point. I think you talked about, you know, when we bring in the talent, I suppose you mentioned, Suzie, some very sort of high profile appointments in recent years, bringing across sort of private sector leaders into the public sector. What are we getting when they land in Whitehall or a local authority? What do they bring to the party? The qualities or skills or areas of expertise that particularly, I guess, impact and have real resonance when they get into the public sector? Suzie, maybe you've obviously worked with a lot of people with very senior skills and have made the jump. What do they bring to the party that the public sector feels it might be lacking?
I think in answer to that, it will be about their commercial experience, a combination of things. And it's an interesting one, actually, because I spoke to a few people who had either made the transition or currently working in public sector, and where they, you know, flip the question around the other way, where they thought there could be some benefits. And so I think, you know, in answer to the question, I think that the people moving across will be coming with really good, robust commercial experience, some different leadership skills. They would have worked in big corporates. They would have worked for, you know, probably 4 or 5 different businesses through their career, typically. And it's about the pace. And I think that's probably the, you know, if you're looking at the sort of those softer skills that they have, it's the leadership skills, it's the ability to deliver at pace, to empower people. And it was I've been reading up on lots of bits, and it was Lord Francis Morden. He's a real advocate of creating momentum. So he thinks that one of the best things you can bring to the party is momentum, dynamism, and empowering people, basically I'm the girl from the Midlands, get stuff done.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what it's all about. And I would imagine, you know, apart from the technical skills, clearly that's probably one of the biggest benefits of people coming in from the private sector, is that they've got that really robust commercial leadership and they can move at a pace. Now, it's all well and good, because a lot of them will have learned that in private sector tech businesses, where they have a kind of fail fast mentality. Well, this is different. Public sector is dealing with the public money. So you've obviously got to be more vigilant in that respect. But yeah, I think it will be about the leadership skills fundamentally, and the ability to deliver at a pace.
David, would you agree with that? And
Yes, I would, and I think that you touched on the caution there. The challenge that I've seen people coming from the private sector is, yes, all of those words come out when people recruit, and you have the member panel, and they go, we strongly support failing fast, as long as it doesn't cost too much. Isn't it? You know, there's always an if and a but that kind of comes through, and I think the gotcha in all of this is that you will hear that desire to fail fast, you'll hear that desire for pace, but you will also hear the desire and the absolute necessity of bringing people with you. So the ones that succeed, those that come across from the private sector that truly succeed, are those that have got quite high EQ, you know, they're quite high emotional quotient, and they get that they need to bring people with them, and they spend that time investing. So what I see succeeding well is starting well.
Yeah.
And those that start well and understand who they've got to bring with them are those. That doesn't mean they can't move at pace. You know, I've got a career where I've done whole scale, you know, restructures of large IT organizations in less than 15 months beginning to end. It's doable, but it's got to be done very much with bringing people with you, and that's probably one of the big challenges that in the private sector you don't have to do that necessarily. Yeah. Although, back to our earlier comments around CSR and around, I think, more maturity around respecting workforce, I think, again, that's another bridge that's forming, you know, where the behaviours, expectations and leadership styles are actually not that different, and they're coming closer together. It's good, it's healthy.
Yeah, we, remembering back to the conference in November, we had Carlos Rivera, who's the Chief Data Officer of the Commonwealth of Virginia in the States, and what was fascinating was that he was talking about, you know, his early days in the role, and he said actually the sort of breakthrough appointment that he made was a communications manager. It wasn't a sort of technical wizard. It was actually about the fact that once he realized that you had to sort of tailor your message to your different stakeholders, whether that was internal or external, and that you couldn't have a sort of one size fits all approach to saying this is what we're going to do, this is my sort of data strategy for the state. Once he realized that it was about the battle of the hearts and minds at first, and understanding the culture of the organization and how to get things done, that was the point at which he could then press the accelerator and start implementing the technical stuff. And that was really interesting to hear a CDO talk about a communications manager as a sort of absolute sort of linchpin of the way they wanted to operate. And I guess that speaks to some of what you're talking about there, David, which is that if you come in with your sort of technical tool belt and not your emotional and sort of soft skills tool belt, you're going to sort of hit the institutional thinking and grind to a halt pretty quickly.
Yeah, a lot of the turnarounds that I've gone in to deal with they've gone pear-shaped because the tech team has steamed off into the distance and forgotten about the users.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not good.
He recognizes that as an issue.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about, I mean, this is one of the sort of typical challenges, right? Is the sort of cultural assimilation into the public sector. Yeah. What are the other pieces where you've seen it? I don't want to dwell on the sort of negative and say, what are the challenges or problems you've seen, and on the flip side, what are the positives? Yeah. What examples have we got where it's worked well, or where we've seen challenges and what's causing them? It'd be interesting to unpack some of that. I
think one of the biggest successes I've seen was Mayank Prakash when he went into HMRC, was it? It was HMRC, and came in from Microsoft, Career Microsoft, and not just Career Microsoft, Career Microsoft US. right? So you can't get much different. But his style and his approach is very thoughtful. He took time and very considered, and he was very humble, a lot of humility with Mount Prakash. And so when he came in as the CIO, of one of the biggest Whitehall departments, and stayed for 4 years, right, to deliver a fundamental transformation of that service in depth and breadth, he earned, significant respect. He actually took over the government CIO role for a while when there was a gap and there was a bit of upheaval going on. And that for me was a real success story. And it was back to my earlier point. He brought with him a wealth of knowledge around how to deal with people. You can't question his tech skills. I mean, nobody gets to VP in Microsoft in the US without being rock solid on the tech side, right? So that wasn't even in the conversation. What was in the conversation was how he could take, I mean, we're talking big workforce here, taking a workforce of 4,000 IT professionals who had been hammered through some horrendous unsuccessful outsourced deals and everything else, and turn that into a positive organization with a culture of ambition and of career progression and of respect back within that organization. That was the success story. The car crash, probably the best would be I can't remember his name now. The guy that came and headed up the national program for IT in 2002. He was vice president from one of the big consulting houses. And his opening gambit, the reason it's seared in my mind, I was working in, I did the policy briefing for the then digital minister, Chris Leslie. I wrote his speech for a national conference, and he was coming on after him. So I'd written this big speech, which he then delivered about how digital is going to transform the way people live and everything else. But said person came on before him, and for 45 minutes, he started his opening gambit on National Programme for IT was, I'm a great believer in liquidated damages in contracts because I intend to use them.
Right.
Wow.
First off the bat.
And then spent 40 minutes basically hammering the private sector and threatening them to within an inch of their lives that if they don't get this right, he is going to go for them. And then my minister had to go on the stage after him with this speech about how good it's going to be.
Well, let's
so there's two extremes.
I think it's fairly shocking diamond, and I think we've probably come a long way in the meantime. As we said, I think we're seeing a lot more people coming in with better emotional skills rather than sort of sledgehammer to crack the nut, as it were.
Stuart Granger.
Say again, David.
Oh,
you got his name? I'm sure he's delighted to remember that. And
I'll find it in it. You carry on.
So before we wrap things up, I guess what I'd like to do is, I think we can see where it can work. We can see what some of the challenges can be. So assuming that we know how to make this work and create the environment for the right private sector leaders to come across in the public sector, I guess the question is, how do we make that happen? What are the solutions that we see opening the sort of taps and helping to facilitate this influx of talent from the private sector? Suzie, I guess that's kind of partly your expertise. So what would you say to that one? How can we make this happen in a sort of successful, meaningful way?
Well, it's certainly the step change in terms of the social responsibility thing will definitely help. Without a shadow of a doubt. How you do it in terms of the volume of numbers of people that potentially the public sector is going to want to recruit. We've talked about data specialists, analysts, etc. We could be talking really large numbers here. I think David made a really interesting point about collaborating with the private sector and maybe for certain specific pretty expensive skill areas like analysts, maybe there is that collaboration set up where it's public sector contracts in collaboration with you gave the example of pharmaceutical with the and partnering with them. That makes perfect sense. The other option is giving people specific tenures. You know, maybe they come in and do a role for a period of up to 3 years potentially, maybe even shorter term contracts, for example, but again in conjunction with some of the really big blue chip corporates could be a really interesting and different way of looking at things. And then I think for me as a headhunter, it'd be about getting people at the right level. And I would be looking to bring your future senior leadership teams in at what we would call that sort of head of level. So they're still up and coming, they're learning their leadership skills, but they've got maybe 8 to 10 years experience post university. I would think that's the sweet spot in terms of the level to try and move people across. They've probably done 2 or 3 chunky commercial roles in the private sector. And if they're high potential talent, they would still potentially be affordable. I think that's way of building your senior leaders of the future in terms of that public sector side. But there will be certain areas, especially in the tech side, where you need specialists and it's just too expensive to bring them in terms of volume. And I think that will come down to collaboration, basically, as to how that works with a joined up thinking with public and private sector.
Is that something you see as well, David, that if you're going to create innovative projects, you need innovative ways of piecing them together, whether that's how you...
And the other thing we need to play in is the broader, there's a broader ecosystem I'll come back to in a sec, but one thing in this landscape, the public sector landscape, we've been through the BPO cycle, you know, where everything was outsourced for a while, and people kind of got the message, we're not doing that anymore, doesn't work. And private sector had similar, actually. So we've all been through, we've all got the t-shirts, doesn't work anymore. I think collaboration, partnership, and is going to be the big name of the game going forward, which is how you can reconcile that affordability gap, because public sector doesn't compete. Well, it does, but it shouldn't. You know, you get 2 neighbouring cities, they will compete. But joking aside, it should be about collaboration. And I think maturing in the private sector tech market, where collaboration whilst protecting IP is now quite commonplace and well rehearsed, I think there's huge opportunity to grow in that space. I've always questioned why we insist on wanting them to be on our payroll and no one else's payroll in public sector, because you can actually handle that governance stuff in other ways. Yeah, and this is my wider ecosystem. One of the ways we've done it quite successfully in the past is actually collaboration with universities. And that works particularly well in the health sector, and can work more, I think, in the local government sector, where you can almost have, the business arms of universities can create the vehicles through which you can create those roles for 2-3 years to do what you need to do. And you're not encumbered then by some of the preconceptions around appropriate reward. So that's an interesting, I think there's more to play at in that space. The ones that have done that successfully are the likes of Imperial, the likes of UCL, they do that well. And actually down in Southampton, they've done that very well in the data and analytics space, working closely with the likes of Ordnance Survey and the ONS, Office of National Statistics, because there's no way as government departments they could pay the kind of money they need to pay to get the people they want. But the university, collaborating with private industry, can create opportunities where everyone can benefit from those roles.
Yeah,
and that will be a fascinating angle, I think, to play through. I mean, I think your point, Suzie, is spot on about that. I mean, it kind of plays back to what I was saying earlier, where a lot of the IT leaders didn't start as technicians in public sector. So many came from private sector, made it to manager roles, and then jumped across. And those that came across with that experience and that knowledge and that commercial knowledge have been the ones that have succeeded, in moving up within public sector. It's a really good point at which you say so you're kind of letting people grow the seeds, and then we'll kind of grow them into the full plant. We'll take them off your hand. Yeah.
I mean, as we draw things to a close now, I think what's exciting is that we can see that these senior leadership roles are going to grow in influence. They're going to become ever more critical to effective government, technology, data. interoperability, collaboration are all going to be absolutely central to the idea of effective government and improving outcomes for citizens and so on. So we need to get the best people. There's no way we can just sort of, bumble along and make do. It's there's no bigger mission than, effectively, running the country. So we need to be doing this. And I think it's interesting to explore some of this idea of where we're going to get talent from, how are we going to find them, how are we going to encourage them across, what are they going to bring, what are the challenges going to be. So I'd like to thank you both for coming along to chat through it, because I think, we're only going to see more of this, and it's exciting time to sort of keep an eye on this space. And Suzie, I know you're going to be sort of there at the thick of it, so you've got some interesting and exciting times in the next few years, I'd imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. This is only just the beginning of this, and we're going to see enormous growth in this space over the next 2 to 3 years. It's exciting.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. So I'd just like to say thanks again, David and Suzie, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much. Cheers.